At 63, Martha Bell walked out of the Cedar Ridge school cafeteria carrying everything she had accumulated in 29 years of work inside one cardboard box. Her job had been outsourced. Her savings were meant to protect what remained of her retirement. And every place she approached for work seemed to find a polite way of telling her the same thing. She was simply too old to start again. Even her son suggested that maybe it was time to slow down. Then Martha did something nobody expected. At a Saturday farm auction, she raised her bidder card and spent $700 on an abandoned chicken operation with a leaking roof, broken equipment, rotten fencing, and no guarantee it would ever produce $1. Roy Mercer laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear and predicted she'd be begging someone to take the place off her hands before winter. Others wondered whether Martha even understood what she'd bought. For a while, it looked as though they were right. The first flock struggled, expenses climbed, and one brutal week nearly put Martha on the ground. But then, something strange began happening inside that battered chicken house. Martha started recording every egg, every pound of feed, every broken shell, every dollar lost, and every minute of work. The numbers began revealing something no one in Cedar Ridge had noticed about the quiet cafeteria worker they had underestimated for nearly 3 decades. Months later, when a professional buyer inspected Martha's operation and opened those handwritten records, she stared at the pages and asked one question that changed how everyone saw the 63-year-old woman. "Where did you learn to run a farm like this?" Martha smiled, because the answer had been hiding in plain sight for 29 years, and it was about to prove exactly why everyone who called her too old had been wrong. Before we reveal what Martha knew that they didn't, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, whether it's morning, afternoon, or late at night. I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. And if you enjoy stories about ordinary people proving that their best chapter can begin when everyone else thinks it's over, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, let's go back to the morning Martha Bell was told her working life was finished. Martha Bell's last morning at Cedar Ridge School began at 5:12, the same time she had arrived for most of 29 years. She unlocked the cafeteria, switched on the fluorescent lights, tied on her apron, and started the ovens before anyone else entered the building. By 7 biscuits were warming and trays of scrambled eggs waited beneath steel lids. Nothing about the work felt like an ending except the cardboard box beneath her desk. The district had hired an outside food service company. Martha's position, along with several others, would disappear after Friday. Her supervisor had emphasized that it wasn't about performance. Somehow that made the dismissal feel colder. At lunch, children moved through the line as they always did. Martha reminded one boy to take fruit and quietly replaced a girl's dropped fork. Nobody looking at her would have known she was counting her final hours. After cleanup, 2 coworkers hugged her. Martha packed her spare shoes, a coffee mug, 3 photographs, and the small notebook she used for inventory calculations. Then she turned off the kitchen lights for the last time at 63. She carried 29 years of work to her car in one box. The following Monday, Martha began looking for another job. She wasn't expecting anything grand. She needed enough income to avoid eating steadily into the savings meant for retirement, household repairs, and medical expenses. At a hardware warehouse, a manager glanced at her application and explained that the position involved lifting 50-pound loads. "It's pretty physical," he said carefully. "I understand what physical means," Martha replied. He promised to call. He didn't. A small grocery store needed someone for early receiving shifts. The interviewer studied Martha's work history. 29 years at one place, that's impressive. Then came the pause Martha was beginning to recognize. "Are you sure you want to start over at your age?" Martha looked directly at him. "If I didn't, I wouldn't be sitting here." She received another polite promise by the end of the week. Neither place had called. Nobody actually said, "You're too old." They didn't need to. Saturday morning, Luke phoned from his home an hour away. Martha was standing at her kitchen counter reviewing expenses when his name appeared on her screen. "How's the job hunt?" he asked. "Quiet." "You've got some savings, Mom. You don't have to panic." "I'm not panicking, I know. I'm just saying maybe it's time to take it easy." Luke meant kindness. Martha knew that. He had worried about her more since Earl died 9 years earlier, as though losing his father had left him responsible for keeping his mother safe. Still, the words landed harder than he intended. Take it easy. The employers had used different language, but Martha heard the same assumption beneath it. Her useful years were behind her. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. After the call, she closed her expense notebook and drove into town for groceries. On the return trip, she took the county road past the fairgrounds. A plywood sign stood beside the entrance, its red lettering large enough to read from the road, "Farm Equipment and Leasehold Auction Saturday." Martha slowed. She had no reason to attend an agricultural auction. Earl had kept vegetables and a modest flock of chickens behind their house years ago, but that was nothing like running a farm. She drove another 100 yards before pulling into a gravel turnout. Something about the sign bothered her, not because she wanted a tractor or equipment, but because she was tired of being told what she should no longer attempt. Martha turned the car around. At the fairgrounds entrance, a plastic-covered auction sheet had been stapled beneath the sign. She stepped out and scanned the listings feeders. Fencing, used implements, storage sheds. Near the bottom was a property-related entry most buyers had probably dismissed immediately. Martha read it once, then again. Former poultry operation, leasehold improvements and operating rights. Beneath it, in bold print, were 2 words and a number that made her remain beside the sign long after a passing truck disappeared down the road. Opening bid, $700. Martha arrived at the auction the following Saturday, telling herself she was only there to look. The former poultry operation sat 3 miles beyond the fairgrounds, on leased farmland at the end of a gravel lane. Buyers wandered between equipment lots before the auction began, but few walked far enough to inspect the chicken house. Martha did. The building was smaller than she had imagined, long and low, with faded metal siding and a roof patched in several places. Weeds crowded the fencing. One gate sagged badly enough that Martha could see daylight beneath it. A weathered shed stood near the rear, and an old water line ran toward the chicken house from a utility connection beside the lane. She read the auction sheet again. The $700 purchase would not include the underlying land. It covered the existing poultry structures, fencing, equipment left on site, and assignment of the remaining long-term leasehold and operating rights. The arrangement explained the low price. Whoever bought it would be paying for the privilege of repairing somebody else's abandoned operation on land they did not own. Planning to raise chickens or collect antiques, Martha turned. Roy Mercer stood behind her with 2 men she recognized from town. At 58, Roy owned Mercer Feed and Supply and had the habit of speaking as though every opinion he had was common knowledge. His companions laughed. Martha looked back at the building. "Haven't decided. That place hasn't produced anything worth buying in a while." "Then I suppose you won't bid?" One of the men coughed to hide another laugh. Roy smiled. "Just trying to save you some trouble." Martha ignored him and walked the perimeter. She pressed a fence post. It shifted. She examined the roof line from the ground, counted visible patches, then found the water shutoff. The structure itself looked straight. That mattered more than paint. "You're looking at the right things." The voice came from an older man in a brown work jacket. Martha recognized Ben Carter after a moment. He had known Earl years ago. "Ben. Been a while." He nodded toward the chicken house. "You thinking about this I'm looking? Looking can get expensive at an auction." Martha smiled. "So can not looking carefully enough." Ben pointed toward the property sheet. "700 isn't the cost of that farm. It's the cost of getting responsibility for it." He mentioned ventilation, water equipment, fencing, bedding, electricity, feed, and birds. You could spend several times the bid before the first egg pays you back. I know 700 isn't the whole bill. Good Ben didn't tell her to buy it or walk away. Earl kept chickens. But this is different. I know that too. When bidding began, Martha stayed near the back. Tools sold first, then feeders, fencing rolls, and a small tractor that climbed beyond anything she could justify. By the time the auctioneer announced the poultry leasehold, several buyers were already loading purchases. Opening at $700, who'll give $7? Silence. The auctioneer repeated the description. Someone behind Martha muttered that the repairs were worth more than the structure. Roy stood with his arms crossed. 700, the auctioneer called again. Martha thought about her savings. She thought about the hardware manager explaining physical labor to her and the grocery interviewer asking whether she really wanted to start over. Anger was a bad reason to spend money. She knew that. So she forced herself to think instead about what she had inspected: a standing structure, usable lease term, water access, fencing that could be repaired, and a price low enough to leave her some room to make mistakes. She raised her bidder card. 700. Thank you. Do I hear 8? Nobody moved. Roy stared at her. 700 going once. Going twice. Martha almost lowered her eyes. Sold! The auctioneer pointed toward her. A few people turned. Roy laughed and said to the man beside him, loudly enough for Martha to hear, "She'll be trying to give it away before winter." Martha signed the paperwork before she could reconsider what she had done. The auction clerk handed her the operating documents and a ring holding 2 old keys. $700 had left her account, and in return, she had acquired a chicken operation that currently contained no chickens. Late that afternoon, Martha drove back alone. She unlocked the outer gate and walked through weeds to the chicken house. For the first time, nobody else was talking around her or telling her what the place was worth. She fitted the second key into the door. The lock resisted, then turned. Martha pulled hard. The swollen door scraped across the threshold, releasing a stale rush of dust and old bedding. She stepped inside and stopped. From outside, the building had looked neglected. Inside, neglect had become damage. A drinker line hung loose from its brackets. Several sections had cracked fittings. Old bedding lay packed dark against the floor. Daylight showed through gaps near the rear wall. One ventilation fan was missing its belt. Another was crusted with rust. A section of interior wire sagged almost to the ground. Martha walked farther in, and something moved near the back. She froze until a rat darted through a hole beneath the wall. She looked at the key in her hand, then at the building she had just bought for $700. Ben had warned her the bid was only the beginning. Standing inside the chicken house, Martha understood exactly how right he had been. Martha returned Monday morning with work gloves, a flashlight, a measuring tape, and the small inventory notebook she had brought home from Cedar Ridge School. She started at the door and inspected the chicken house as if it were a kitchen being prepared for inspection. The old bedding had to be removed. Several drinker fittings were cracked, and one section of line appeared useless. 2 fence posts at the rear were soft with rot. The ventilation fan nearest the center wall would not turn when she tested it by hand. The door left a gap along the bottom wide enough for rodents. Martha wrote down each problem, then added 3 columns beside it: necessary, later, cost. By 10 o'clock, the necessary column was longer than she wanted. A truck came down the gravel lane shortly before noon. Luke stepped out and stared at the chicken house before looking at his mother. "You actually bought it?" Martha closed her notebook. "Apparently news travels. Roy Mercer mentioned it to somebody who knows somebody I work with." "Of course he did." Luke walked inside. His expression changed as he examined the sagging wire and old electrical fixtures. "Mom, you didn't tell me because you knew I'd say this was a bad idea. I didn't tell you because I'm 63, not 16. That's not what I mean. Then don't say it like that." Luke exhaled and crouched near an outlet. "Did anyone inspect this electrical system?" "Not yet." "Don't energize anything until I do," Martha started to object, then stopped. Luke was an electrician on this subject. Pride would be expensive. Fine. He'd spent nearly an hour checking the panel, visible wiring, fan connections, and outlets. Nothing suggested the entire system needed replacing, but several components required repair before use. Luke stood beside her notebook and began estimating costs. Electrical repairs, water lines, fan, fencing, cleaning, feeders, then chickens and feed. $700 was the cheap part. Ben Carter already told me. Then why buy it? Martha looked around the empty building. "Because I think I can make something work here." "With what money? Not by fixing everything at once." Luke shook his head. "You don't have enough savings to experiment forever." "I don't intend to." He looked ready to argue again, but Martha opened the notebook. "Water first, ventilation, secure fencing, everything cosmetic waits." Luke's expression softened slightly. "At least promise me you'll let me handle the electrical repairs. I'll pay you." "Mom, you're not turning this into a free project because you're worried about me. I'm your son, and you're a tradesman." They settled on Luke helping inspect and repair only what required his expertise, with Martha covering materials. He left, still unconvinced, but before driving away, he repeated, "Don't touch that panel," Martha promised. The next morning, she began clearing debris outside. A woman in rubber boots approached from the neighboring property, carrying a bucket. "You're Martha Bell." "Depends who's asking," the woman smiled. "Hannah Reed. I work part-time at the veterinary clinic. I keep some poultry next door." She glanced toward the chicken house. "I heard somebody bought this place." Martha waited for the joke. None came. Instead, Hannah walked toward the rear fence. "You planning to put birds in soon?" "Once it's safe." Hannah stopped near the two rotten posts and pointed lower. Beneath weeds, the wire had been pushed outward, leaving a narrow opening close to the ground. Paw prints marked the soft dirt beyond it. "Then I'd put this near the top of your list." Martha crouched. She had noticed the posts, but not the gap. "Fox could be. Raccoons, too." "Doesn't matter much after they get inside." Martha wrote predator access beneath fencing and underlined it. The omission embarrassed her. Earl's backyard flock had been small enough that problems were obvious from the kitchen window. This property required different eyes. "I know chickens," Martha said, more defensively than she intended. Hannah nodded. "I'm sure you do, but every setup teaches you something new." Martha looked at her, then crossed out the excuse forming in her mind. "What else am I missing?" They spent 20 minutes walking the perimeter. Hannah pointed out where weeds concealed weak fencing and where drainage could become a problem after heavy rain. She did not tell Martha how to run the farm. She simply showed her what to inspect before birds arrived. After Hannah left, Martha sat on an overturned bucket and reviewed the list. Luke was right about the money. Hannah was right about the gaps in her knowledge. For the first time since raising her bidder card, Martha felt the distance between wanting the farm to work and knowing how to make it work. She could not repair everything. She could not afford to learn every lesson by losing chickens. So she did what she had done for years when the school cafeteria faced a limited budget and too many demands. She prioritized water, ventilation, predator protection, sanitation, safe electricity. The rest could wait. That afternoon, she called a nearby poultry seller whose number Hannah had given her and asked about availability for a small laying flock. The seller had birds becoming available in 3 weeks. After that, Martha would have to wait considerably longer for the next suitable group. She thanked him and ended the call. 3 weeks. Martha looked from the broken drinker line to the dead fan, then through the open door toward the damaged rear fence. The farm did not have to be beautiful by then. It did not even have to be finished. But if Martha wanted her first flock, she had exactly 3 weeks to make it safe enough to keep them alive. Martha wrote 3 weeks across the top of a fresh notebook page and divided the work beneath it. She did not list everything the farm needed. She listed only what the first flock needed to survive: safe water, working ventilation, secure fencing, clean bedding, and reliable electricity. Anything that did not belong under one of those headings waited. The first days were spent removing old bedding and debris from the chicken house. Martha worked in short stretches, filling a wheelbarrow, hauling it outside, then returning for another load. Years in the cafeteria had taught her that unpleasant work became manageable when broken into routines. By the 4th day, the concrete beneath the old litter was visible again. Luke returned Saturday with tools and replacement electrical parts. He repaired 2 damaged connections, replaced a cracked outlet, and tested the fan circuits. Martha stayed out of the panel as promised. "Center fan motor's still good," Luke said. "The belt isn't. Cheaper problem. For once, they found a replacement belt locally, and the fan turned again that afternoon." Martha smiled at the rush of stale air moving toward the vents. Luke pointed upward. "That doesn't mean you climb up there if anything else goes wrong. I heard you the first 6 times. 2 days later, Martha nearly proved why he kept repeating it. She was fastening wire along an upper section of the rear enclosure when the old stepladder shifted beneath her. One foot slipped. She grabbed the fence post and caught herself before falling, but the sudden pull sent pain through her shoulder. Luke, who had been unloading electrical conduit from his truck, crossed the yard immediately. "Get down." "I'm fine. Get down, Mom!" His tone stopped her more effectively than shouting would have. Martha climbed down slowly. Luke steadied the ladder, then pushed it aside. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. I lost my footing. Yes, people get hurt that way. Farm work doesn't happen from a chair. I know that." His frustration broke through. "I'm not scared you're going to fail at raising chickens. I'm scared you're going to break a hip trying to prove you can do every job alone." Martha looked away. "I'm not proving anything." Luke stared at her until she knew he didn't believe it. "Then why won't you call me before you climb an old ladder by yourself?" She did not have an answer she liked. Finally, Martha said, "Because everyone already thinks buying this place was foolish." Luke's voice softened. "I'm not everyone." She looked at him. "No, you're the one who thinks I'm going to hurt myself because I love you. That's different." The distinction stayed with her. Martha agreed to one rule: no work at height alone. Luke agreed not to treat every difficult task as evidence she should sell the farm. They shook hands on it, half serious and half embarrassed. Hannah helped next with cleaning procedures and basic biosecurity. She showed Martha where to keep dedicated boots, how to control traffic into the chicken house, and why clean water lines mattered as much as fresh bedding. Martha wrote everything down. "You really record all of it?" Hannah asked. "If I have to remember it twice, I write it once." They repaired the weakest section of rear fencing together and secured the low gap where Hannah had found tracks. By the end of the 2nd week, Martha could stand at the entrance and see progress. The building still looked old, paint peeled, one unused side section remained cluttered, but the area prepared for birds was dry, enclosed, ventilated, and clean. Then Martha went to Mercer Feed and Supply to price the first month of feed. Roy was behind the counter. He looked at her list and named a price that made Martha calculate twice.
That's the small quantity rate. That's the rate for what you're buying. What about the larger account price?
Roy leaned against the counter. Commercial customers ordering volume get better pricing. I'm operating commercially. Roy gave her a patient smile she disliked immediately. You're buying like a backyard flock. Martha kept her voice level. Can you meet the larger rate or not? Not at that quantity. She thanked him and left without buying. In the truck, Martha worked through the numbers. Feed at Roy's price would make every dozen eggs harder to sell profitably before she owned a single hen. That evening, Ben Carter stopped by after hearing she had the center fan working. Martha showed him the feed calculation. I can't compete with farms buying by the ton. Ben nodded. Then don't. That's useful. I'm serious. Big operators win on volume. You don't have volume. Martha looked toward the cleaned section of chicken house. So what do I have? Small enough to know exactly what you're producing. Close enough to town to sell local. Maybe that's worth more than cheap eggs. The idea irritated her because it sounded less like a solution than an admission that she could not compete. Then she remembered the cafeteria. When the budget changed, she had never solved the problem by pretending ingredients cost less. She changed the menu. Martha opened her notebook. Her original plan had assumed she would sell ordinary eggs at ordinary prices and make up the difference through enough production. The feed numbers made that unrealistic. She crossed out the line. Then she wrote a new one beneath it. Quality local eggs, small scale. The farm would not survive by becoming a smaller version of the operations Roy respected. If Martha was going to make it work, she would have to build a different kind of farm. The laying hens arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in stacked transport crates. Martha had deliberately ordered a small flock, enough to test the chicken house without committing money she could not recover. When the seller opened the first crate, the hens emerged cautiously, some standing still before moving toward the fresh bedding. Martha watched them spread through the prepared section and felt the farm change around her. Until that moment, she had been repairing an abandoned building. Now something depended on her. The feeling lasted until the first drinker fitting began leaking. Martha found wet bedding beneath it less than an hour later. She shut that section off, replaced the fitting, and removed the damp litter. The next morning, another connection dripped. By the third day, she was checking the line almost obsessively. The hens brought other worries. They had been moved into an unfamiliar environment, and their egg production dropped sharply. Martha knew relocation could cause stress, but knowing it did not make the nearly empty collection basket easier to carry. She rose before dawn, drove to the farm, checked water and feed, inspected fencing, cleaned problem areas, gathered eggs, and returned later for another inspection. Her shoulders hurt by evening. The farm had not produced enough eggs to pay for the fuel she used reaching it, at Mercer Feed and Supply. Roy saw her loading bags into her truck. "How's the empire?" he asked. "Still standing?" "How many eggs?" That continued lifting a bag onto the bed. "Enough to keep me busy." Roy laughed. "Heard those birds aren't laying much." She wondered who had told him, then decided it did not matter. They've just been moved. Maybe, but feed gets expensive while you're waiting. A customer near the counter smiled. Roy added, "I still say that place won't make winter." Martha drove away angry enough to make a bad decision by that evening. She had convinced herself that the problem was scale. More hens meant more eggs meant more revenue. She called Hannah and asked where she could buy another group quickly. Hannah was silent for a moment. "Why are you adding birds?" "Because I need production. Your current birds aren't producing normally yet."
which is exactly the problem. Hannah came over instead of arguing by phone. She watched the hens, checked the water line, then asked Martha to show her the daily routine. Martha described it from memory. "What time do the lights come on?" Hannah asked. Martha hesitated. "Depends when I arrive. And yesterday, later than today." Hannah nodded toward the drinkers. "You've had water interruptions too. Short ones. Short matters when they're already stressed." Hannah did not say Martha was failing. That somehow made it easier to listen. They reviewed the environment carefully. The flock's lighting schedule was inconsistent. Water access had been disrupted during repairs, and the birds were still settling after transport. "Adding more hens doesn't fix any of that," Hannah said. Martha looked toward the crates she had already imagined ordering. "It just gives me more birds with the same problems. And more feed bills." Martha canceled the idea before she could spend the money. That night, she opened the notebook she had used at Cedar Ridge School for 29 years. Guessing had never been enough when hundreds of meals depended on inventory arriving on time. She had tracked milk cartons, produce portions, waste, and shortages. Chickens were not school lunches, but numbers still told the truth. On a clean page, she created columns: date, feed used, eggs collected, cracked eggs, water problems, temperature, lighting hours. She added notes for anything unusual. Every morning and evening she filled them in. The routine revealed details memory had blurred. Egg numbers were better on days after uninterrupted water. Breakage decreased after Martha adjusted nesting areas. Hannah helped her establish consistent lighting rather than changing it around Martha's arrival time. By the end of the first week of records, production was still disappointing, but it had stopped falling. During the second week, the collection basket grew heavier. Martha refused to celebrate one good morning. She waited for the numbers. 3 days improved, then 5. By the 14th day, she sat at the small work table inside the shed and totaled the week's production. The flock was laying substantially better than when it arrived. She ran the calculation again, this time including feed packaging, bedding, and the portion of operating costs she could estimate. Her satisfaction disappeared. The hens were improving. The farm itself was functioning. But Martha's cost per dozen remained higher than the price ordinary eggs were bringing at local stores. She stared at the figure, then at the line she had written weeks earlier: quality local eggs, small scale. Producing more eggs had answered one question. It had created another. If Martha sold them for what everyone expected eggs to cost, every dozen leaving the farm would carry part of her savings with it. Martha spent Sunday evening trying to make the numbers say something kinder. They refused. Even with production improving, selling at ordinary store prices would leave too little after feed, packaging, bedding, and fuel. By Monday morning, she stopped treating that as a problem she could outwork. She needed customers willing to pay more for consistent local eggs. Hannah gave her the name of Denise Alvarez, manager of an independent food store in the next town. Martha called before she could talk herself out of it. Denise agreed to meet, but offered no promises. Martha arrived carrying 2 cartons and her production notebook. Denise opened each carton, checked shell condition, then asked questions about flock size, collection, cleaning, and storage. "I can sell local," Denise said. "But local isn't enough by itself. I need dependable supply, clean packaging, consistent quality, and delivery when you say you'll deliver." "How much?" Denise named a small, weekly quantity for a trial order. Martha calculated silently. The price was better than commodity retail, but only if she could meet the standard without waste. "I can do that." Denise looked at her. "Don't say yes because you want the account. I'm saying yes because I checked my numbers before I came." That earned the first hint of a smile. Back in Cedar Ridge, another problem waited. Martha asked Roy about opening a feed account so she could manage timing between purchases and egg payments. Roy shook his head. Not enough operating history. I've paid cash every time, and you can keep paying cash. Would you say the same thing to a younger farmer? Roy's expression tightened. I'd say it to a new operation buying your volume. Martha wanted to argue. Instead, she asked for the exact cash price, wrote it down, and left. Pride would not pay an invoice. She returned to her notebook and rearranged expenses. Paint could wait. The unused side of the chicken house could wait. A replacement gate she wanted rather than needed could wait. Feed could not. 2 days later, Luke stopped by and found her surrounded by receipts at the work table. You doing taxes already? Trying not to become a cautionary tale. He picked up a sheet showing feed costs, egg production, packaging, and projected income from Denise's trial order. You track all this every day? I tracked more than this at the school. Luke studied the figures longer than she expected. I thought you bought this place because you were angry. Martha looked at him. I was angry. That's not the same as being reckless. I guess. Thank you for that magnificent endorsement, he laughed. Don't get used to it. The first delivery was due Friday morning. On Thursday afternoon, Martha counted the eggs that met Denise's standard and felt her stomach tighten. She was short. Production had been adequate, but several eggs were cracked or too dirty to include. She could fill the order only by lowering the standard. Martha held one questionable egg beneath the light, then put it aside. At Cedar Ridge School, she had learned that shortages did not become acceptable products simply because someone needed a number filled. She called Denise. I promised 10 dozen tomorrow. I can deliver 8 that meet the quality we discussed. There was a pause. What happened? Martha explained. I can bring the other 2 dozen, but I don't think you should sell them. Then don't bring them. That closed her eyes. I understand if that ends the trial. Did you know you were short before you called? I finished grading them 10 minutes ago. Denise's voice softened. Bring the 8. The next morning, Martha arrived exactly when promised. Denise inspected several cartons while Martha waited. These are good. There just aren't enough of them. We'll adjust this week's invoice. Denise closed the carton. I'd rather get 8 honest dozen than 10 bad ones. Martha carried the empty transport crates back to her truck, feeling both relieved and embarrassed. She had lost revenue on her first commercial order. Yet Denise had not rejected her, more importantly. Martha understood what the buyer had actually purchased, not merely eggs. Reliability included telling the truth when the numbers went wrong. That afternoon, she reviewed why so many eggs had been rejected and adjusted collection times and nesting maintenance. She recorded every loss rather than hiding it from herself. The following week, production held steadier. Martha filled the trial quantity. The week after that, she did it again. Roy still required cash for feed. The farm still had repairs waiting. Martha was nowhere near comfortable enough to call the operation secure. Then Denise phoned while Martha was gathering the last eggs of the morning. I've been watching how your cartons move, she said. Martha braced herself. And customers are coming back for them. If you can maintain what you've been doing, I'd like to make this a weekly order. That looked across the old chicken house at the hens moving through the bedding. The numbers had not become easy. They had finally become possible. Denise was offering her the farm's first regular customer. The heat arrived on a Wednesday and settled over Cedar Ridge like a weight by 6 in the morning. Martha could already feel moisture gathering beneath her collar. She checked the water line twice before feeding, then stood beneath the center ventilation fan and listened. It was running, but the air inside the chicken house still felt heavy. By afternoon, several hens were panting. Egg production dropped the next day. Martha opened every safe ventilation point and checked water repeatedly, but the old system had never been designed for efficiency. She began arriving earlier and staying later, afraid that one missed problem would undo everything she had built.
On Friday, she carried a feed bag from her truck toward the shed, despite the heat. Halfway there, the ground seemed to tilt. Martha stopped. Her hands felt strangely light. She lowered the bag, but when she straightened, black specks moved across her vision. Martha. Hannah's voice came from behind the fence. Martha reached for the truck bed. Hannah crossed the yard quickly and took her arm. Sit down. I just stood up too fast. Sit. That lowered herself onto the shaded step beside the shed. Hannah brought water and waited until Martha drank. How long have you been out here? Since before 6. And how much water have you had? Martha did not answer. Hannah gave her a look. You're monitoring the chickens better than you're monitoring yourself. They're the ones producing income. Not if their farmer drops in the yard. Hannah checked the flock while Martha remained seated. Water was flowing, but the temperature inside was still too high. They adjusted airflow and moved the day's remaining work until evening. Martha hated sitting while Hannah worked. She hated even more that standing too quickly brought the dizziness back. Luke arrived less than an hour later. Martha knew Hannah had called him before he even got out of the truck. You nearly passed out, he asked. I got lightheaded. In this heat? I'm fine now. Luke looked at Hannah. She was not fine. Martha frowned. I don't need a committee. No, Luke said. You need to stop treating every limit like an insult. The words stung because they were close to something Martha had been avoiding. I have orders to fill. And what happens to those orders if you're in the hospital? I'm not going to the hospital. That's not the point. Luke lowered his voice. Mom, being 63 isn't the problem. Acting like you're 23 is. Martha stared at him. Months earlier, she would have heard only 63. She would have taken the sentence as another warning that her useful years were over. This time, she heard the rest. Hannah sat on an overturned bucket nearby without interrupting. I don't want people doing this for me, Martha finally said. Luke frowned. Doing what? The hard parts. The heavy parts. Coming every time something goes wrong. Why? That looked toward the chicken house. Because everybody already thought I was too old. If I need help every week, then maybe all I've proved is that they were right. Luke shook his head. You call me when the wiring needs an electrician. You ask Hannah when the chickens need something you don't know. That's not failing. That's running a farm without pretending you're an electrician. A veterinarian. And 23 years old. Hannah smiled slightly. He's annoyingly correct. Martha almost laughed. Instead, she looked at the feed bag, still lying where she had dropped it. She had spent weeks studying every number except the cost of treating her own body as unlimited equipment. That evening, the three of them changed the work routine. Martha shifted physical jobs to early morning and evening during extreme heat. Hannah helped establish additional water checks. Luke found a suitable backup fan and arranged a safer electrical connection. They moved a sturdy utility cart from the shed into daily use so Martha could roll feed and supplies instead of carrying everything. Martha wrote the changes into her notebook like any other operating procedure. The next several days were still difficult. Egg production remained below normal, and Martha had to tell Denise that the heat had reduced output. Denise accepted a temporary smaller delivery rather than lower quality. Martha stopped trying to recover every lost egg by working longer hours. She concentrated on keeping the flock stable. Gradually, the hens responded. Panting decreased as the weather eased. Water consumption normalized. Egg numbers began climbing again. Martha's own routine changed with them. She rested before she was exhausted. She used the cart even when she thought she could carry the load. The first time Luke saw her rolling 2 feed bags instead of lifting them, he said nothing, which Martha appreciated more than praise. By the following week, production had nearly returned to its earlier level. Martha was recording the morning count when her phone rang. Denise's name appeared on the screen. Your eggs are selling faster than I expected, Denise said. That's a good problem. Maybe I need to know whether you're interested in making it a bigger one.
That stopped writing. How much bigger if quality stays where it is? I'd like roughly twice the current weekly order. Martha looked across the flock, then at the backup fan Luke had helped install a month earlier. She might have said yes before Denise finished the sentence. Now she asked the question that mattered. When would you need me at that volume? Denise answered, 6 weeks. That looked down at her production records. 6 weeks to double an order she had only recently learned to fill. This time, proving she could do it would require knowing exactly how much she could safely grow. Martha's first impulse was to call the poultry seller and ask how many laying hens he could deliver. She had his number open on her phone before she stopped herself. Doubling the order did not simply mean doubling the birds. It meant more feed, more packaging, more water, more cleaning, more labor, and more money exposed if production fell. Martha put the phone down and opened her notebook. She calculated the flock's average laying rate from the previous weeks, then estimated how many additional hens she would actually need. She added feed consumption, rejected eggs, packaging, fuel, and a margin for birds that might not produce as expected. The numbers filled 2 pages. By evening, one conclusion was clear. Trying to double immediately would push the farm harder than she was willing to risk. The next morning she called Denise. I can't give you twice the current order all at once. There was a brief silence. All right, but I can increase it in 2 stages. First increase in 3 weeks, if production holds. I reach the larger amount 3 weeks after that. Can you guarantee the second increase? No. I can guarantee. I won't promise eggs I don't have. Denise laughed softly. Send me the schedule. Martha did. An hour later, Denise approved it. That afternoon, Martha went to Mercer Feed and Supply with her projected feed requirements. Roy looked over the quantities. Heard you're trying to expand. A little. Careful. Getting one customer is easier than keeping one when you can't fill the order. Months earlier, Martha might have heard only the insult. Now she heard a risk she had already calculated. That's why I'm not doubling at once. Roy raised an eyebrow. Thought you'd be buying another full flock. I thought about it. Changed your mind? The numbers did. Roy handed back the sheet. Numbers have a way of doing that. Martha ordered only enough feed to support the staged increase. She still had to pay cash, and that fact kept her expansion grounded in what the farm could actually afford. The poultry seller had a smaller group of compatible laying hens available. Martha bought enough to support the first stage without crowding the prepared section. Hannah helped her plan the introduction and adjust the flock rotation so the new birds could settle without disrupting the existing hens more than necessary. Slow is boring, Hannah said while they checked the separation area. Boring is cheaper than disaster. You've changed, Martha smiled. I've become more interested in sleeping at night. The electrical load needed attention before the additional equipment ran regularly. Luke inspected the system and proposed a safer improvement to the circuit serving the ventilation and work area. This time, Martha did not argue about whether she needed it. They discussed materials and cost first. I can do the labor, Luke said, and I'm paying for the materials. I knew that part was coming. Good. Saves us time. He completed the work over a Saturday morning while Martha used the utility cart to move supplies. Luke watched her roll past with a feed bag. Look at that. Don't start. Didn't say anything. Your face did. By the 3rd week, the new hens were settling, but production fluctuated enough to make Martha nervous. She checked her figures rather than responding by adding birds. The existing flock remained steady. The newer hens needed time. Denise received the first increased order on schedule. Martha did not allow herself to call it success until the second delivery matched it. Ben stopped by near the end of the 4th week. He looked over the flock, the cleaned work area, and Martha's production sheet clipped beside the door. "You're finally starting to act like a farmer." Martha looked at him. "What was I doing before? Trying to prove you were one?" "There's a difference, big one. A farmer asks what the operation can carry. Somebody proving something asks what they can survive." Martha glanced at the card, then toward the additional hens. "I suppose you're going to take credit for that wisdom." "Absolutely," she laughed and handed him a carton of eggs. "Then that's your consulting fee." The final 2 weeks tested the staged plan. Feed consumption rose almost exactly within Martha's projected range. Egg production climbed more slowly, then stabilized. She adjusted collection routines and watched rejected eggs carefully. When one day's count fell short, she did not panic. The weekly total still held. At the end of the 6th week, Martha packed Denise's full, expanded order. She counted every carton twice before loading the truck. Denise inspected the delivery at the store, then compared it with Martha's schedule. "You made the volume this week. You've made every increase you promised." That resisted the urge to turn that sentence into certainty. "I want to see whether the flock holds it." Denise nodded. "So do I." She closed the final carton and handed Martha the invoice copy. "Keep this quality and volume consistent for another month, and I'll put something longer term in writing." Martha carried the empty crates back toward her truck. A long-term supply agreement would mean predictable sales instead of hoping each week's eggs found a buyer. It would also mean Denise expected the farm to keep performing after the excitement of proving everyone wrong had worn off. Martha looked at the invoice in her hand. She had reached the production target. Now she had 1 month to prove the farm could live there. The month began without drama, which made Martha suspicious for 12 days. Production stayed within range. Denise's deliveries left on time, and feed consumption matched Martha's projections closely enough that she stopped recalculating every evening. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the feed supplier called. The scheduled delivery would be delayed. "How long?" Martha asked. "Could be 4 days. Maybe 5. Months earlier, those words would have sent her directly to Mercer Feed and Supply to buy whatever Roy had available. Instead, Martha thanked the supplier, walked into the shed, and opened her inventory notebook. She checked the physical feed remaining, compared it with recorded daily consumption, then calculated again with a conservative allowance. 5 days would leave almost no margin. 6 would be a problem. She called 2 suppliers outside Cedar Ridge. The first could not help. The second had the feed she needed, but delivery charges made a small order expensive. Martha calculated the difference against buying locally from Roy. Then she drove to Mercer Feed and Supply. Roy checked his stock. "I've got enough, but I'm not bumping another customer's order. I'm not asking you to—" "Cash terms still apply." "I know. Martha bought only enough to cover the gap until the delayed delivery should arrive. The remainder came from the second supplier in a quantity large enough to make the delivery cost reasonable. She did not panic buy. She did not fill the shed with expensive feed simply because she was afraid of running out. When the original shipment arrived on the 5th day, the flock had never missed a feeding." Martha wrote the actual cost beside her estimate and circled the difference. The disruption had cost money, but not nearly what fear would have cost her. Denise visited the farm the following week. Martha had expected her to inspect the hens first. Instead, Denise stopped at the work table where Martha's clipboard hung beside the production notebook. "What's all this?" "Records." "I can see that." Denise turned several pages. "Daily egg counts, cracked and rejected eggs, feed usage, water checks, cleaning dates, packaging inventory, delivery schedules, cost per dozen, notes explaining unusual changes. You keep sanitation logs too, if something goes wrong. I want to know what happened before it went wrong." Denise walked through the chicken house, checked the storage area, and watched Martha collect and sort the morning eggs. She asked about the recent feed delay. Martha showed her the inventory calculation and the purchases that had bridged the shortage. "You knew exactly how many days you had?" Denise asked. "Approximately." "Chickens don't read spreadsheets," Denise smiled. "Most small suppliers I meet can tell me how hard they're working. Fewer can tell me what each dozen actually costs them." Martha closed the notebook. Hard work isn't a number. The sentence sounded familiar, even though she had never said it aloud before. For years at Cedar Ridge School, nobody had cared how tired Martha was at the end of lunch service. Hundreds of meals still had to be prepared with the food available, within budget, under sanitation rules, and on schedule. Denise looked again at the records. "Where did you learn to run a farm like this?" Martha almost answered that she was still learning. Then she understood what Denise was really asking. The hens were new, the building was new, the business was new, the discipline behind it was not. School cafeteria. Martha said, 29 years. Denise looked surprised. Martha tapped the inventory page. We tracked food, portions, waste, deliveries, shortages. If something didn't arrive, children still had to eat. If the budget changed, we adjusted. If we wasted too much, the numbers told us, "So you've been doing this longer than you thought, just without chickens." They both laughed. But after Denise left to finish her inspection, Martha remained beside the work table. She remembered carrying that cardboard box from the school and believing 29 years had ended because somebody eliminated her position. The hardware manager had seen a 63-year-old who might struggle with 50-pound loads. The grocery interviewer had seen someone unusually old to start again. Roy had seen a woman playing at farming. Even Martha had treated the cafeteria years as something behind her. Yet every page hanging on the wall contradicted that. She had not arrived at the farm empty-handed. Her experience simply had a different name. Near the end of the visit, Denise returned from her car carrying a folder. Quality has held. Deliveries have held. Even when your feed got delayed, you handled it without changing what reached my shelves. She placed the folder on Martha's work table. Inside was a proposed long-term supply agreement based on the volume Martha had maintained during the month. Martha stared at the quantity, price, delivery schedule, and term. Months earlier, she would have signed before Denise could reconsider. Now she reached for a pencil. "I want to take this home and run the numbers." Denise nodded. "That's one reason I'm offering it to you." After she drove away, Martha sat alone in the shed with the agreement beside her notebook. On paper, the farm could meet the order. The sales were real. The records proved it. But Martha remembered the heat, the dizziness, and Luke telling her that surviving the workload was not the same as building something sustainable. She had spent months proving the chicken farm could work. Before signing anything, Martha needed to answer one final question. Could it keep working without requiring her to sacrifice herself to it? Martha did not sign Denise's agreement that night. She spread the contract beside her production records at the kitchen table and calculated what the promised volume would require during an ordinary week. Then, during a bad one, she counted feed costs, packaging, fuel, rejected eggs, maintenance, and the hours she actually spent at the farm. Then she added something her first calculations had ignored, her own limits. The numbers showed the farm could supply Denise's proposed volume, but only with little room for illness, extreme weather, or equipment trouble. Martha reduced the quantity and called Denise the next morning. "I want the agreement," she said, "but not at the volume you proposed. You maintained that volume for a month." "I did. That proves I can reach it. It doesn't prove I should promise it every week." Martha proposed a slightly smaller guaranteed supply, with additional eggs available when production allowed. Denise was quiet long enough to make Martha wonder whether caution had cost her the contract. "You realize most suppliers negotiate upward?" Denise said. Most suppliers probably aren't 63 and trying to avoid becoming their own worst employee. Denise laughed. Send me the revised number. 2 days later, they signed. The agreement did not make Martha rich. It did something more useful. It gave the farm predictable weekly sales at a price that covered its operating costs and left a modest profit. Martha used part of that profit to repair the property gradually instead of draining her savings. A damaged gate was replaced. Another section of fencing was strengthened. The chicken house remained old, but fewer things on Martha's list carried the word necessary beside them. She kept the work schedule developed after the heat wave. Heavy jobs happened during cooler hours. The utility cart carried feed and supplies. When electrical work required Luke, she called Luke. When flock health raised a question beyond her experience, she called Hannah. Asking no longer felt like surrender. One Saturday, Luke arrived while Martha was unloading feed. She lowered 2 bags onto the utility cart instead of lifting them individually toward the shed. Luke leaned against his truck. Well, look at that. Martha kept pushing. Don't ruin it. I was going to say you finally learned something. I learned I don't get extra money for hurting my back. Luke laughed and followed her toward the chicken house. He no longer inspected every corner, as though searching for evidence the farm was about to destroy her. Instead, he asked about production, checked a switch Martha had mentioned, and accepted a carton of eggs before leaving. Martha noticed the difference. Luke was no longer trying to rescue her from the farm, and she was no longer treating his concern as proof that he doubted her. Hannah continued stopping by, sometimes because Martha had a question, and sometimes simply because she wanted coffee and conversation. Ben appeared less often when he did. Martha no longer followed him around, asking whether each decision sounded sensible. One morning he glanced at her records and said, "Looks like you don't need much consulting anymore." Martha handed him another carton. "Good. Your fees were getting expensive." The person whose approval had once irritated her most remained Roy Mercer. Martha still bought some supplies from him, always on the same ordinary terms as before. One afternoon, she entered Mercer Feed and Supply to collect a scheduled order. Roy checked the invoice, then looked through the window toward her truck. "How many layers you running now?" Martha told him. Roy paused. Months earlier, he had laughed at the idea that she could make winter. Now there was no joke in his expression. "That's a real operation." Martha waited for the satisfaction she once imagined those words would bring. It came, but smaller than expected. "It is," she said. Roy nodded and returned to the invoice. There was no apology, no audience, no dramatic admission that he had been wrong. Martha realized she did not need one. By late afternoon, she was back at the farm. The hens moved through the fenced pasture while sunlight stretched across the grass. Martha checked the water system, walked the perimeter, gathered the final eggs, and entered the day's production in her notebook. The figures were ordinary. That pleased her. Ordinary meant the farm no longer survived on excitement or defiance. It survived on routine. She closed the notebook and picked up the ring of old keys she had been given after the auction. $700. She could still remember standing among strangers with her bidder card raised while nobody else offered $800. She remembered Roy saying she would give the place away before winter. At the time, she had wanted desperately to prove him wrong, but $700 had never purchased success. It had purchased a neglected chicken house, damaged fencing, old equipment, leasehold rights, and an opportunity. What made that opportunity useful had been carried into the farm by a woman everyone assumed was starting from nothing. For 29 years at Cedar Ridge School, Martha had tracked inventory, controlled waste, adjusted when deliveries failed, maintained sanitation, worked within budgets, and served hundreds of meals on schedule. Nobody had called those skills farming. Neither had she. Yet when the feed delivery failed, those skills prevented panic. When production fluctuated, they showed her why. When Denise demanded consistency, they gave Martha a system capable of providing it. Age had not made those years disappear. It had accumulated them. But Martha had learned something else, too. Being 63 did matter. Her body recovered more slowly. Heat affected her. Heavy lifting carried consequences. Pretending otherwise had nearly put her on the ground. Proving herself had never required proving she had no limits. It required building an operation that respected them. Martha looked across the chicken house. A farmer was not whoever could carry the heaviest feed bag or work the longest without sitting down. A farmer was the person who kept the animals healthy, understood the costs, delivered what had been promised, adapted when something failed, and knew when asking for help protected the operation rather than weakened it. Months earlier, employers had looked at Martha and seen a woman nearing the end of her useful working life. Martha had almost accepted their definition by believing somebody needed to hire her before her experience counted. Now the chicken farm produced a modest, steady income. Denise had reliable eggs. Repairs were being paid from earnings instead of hope. Luke could worry without controlling her. Hannah had become a friend rather than simply the neighbor who knew more about chickens. Martha had not become younger. She had become more certain of what decades of work had already made her capable of doing. She switched off the shed light as evening settled over the farm. The old chicken house remained illuminated behind her, ventilation humming steadily while the flock settled inside. People had laughed when a 63-year-old woman paid $700 for it. They thought she was buying a failure because they saw only her age and the condition of the building. Martha finally understood what they had missed. She had not needed to become someone new to prove them wrong. She had needed the chance to use everything they had failed to see.